Can too much national pride hinder your own country? Can your rights be overshadowed by your responsibilities? In the case of Britain's adoption of Newtonian calculus, the answer is yes, it can. During the early 1700s, British mathematicians' right to choose any method of calculus was overshadowed by their responsibility to adopt Newtonian calculus, reflecting a cultural emphasis on national pride while also hindering mathematical progress. The reason for this was the conflict between Isaac Newton and Gottfried Leibniz concerning the invention of calculus. At this time, new scientific or mathematical discoveries were highly regarded.
Well, the priority dispute between Newton and Leibniz over the calculus was exactly what it sounds like, really, a dispute over who was first. This was a dispute that began to blow up gradually during the 1690s after Leibniz had published his calculus. It didn't come to begin with from Newton directly, but from one of Newton's followers, in this case Fatio de Douillet, who began to say that Newton had discovered some of this material first, that Leibniz had possibly got hold of it from Newton or borrowed Newton's ideas, whatever. And this dispute gradually blew up.
As the debate continued on, Leibniz appealed to the Royal Society to make an official decision. The Royal Society was originally a place to put aside differences for the improvement of mathematics and science. Both Leibniz and Newton were fellows of the Royal Society. However, Newton was also the president at this time. In this, Newton had an advantage over Leibniz.
And they fought very bitterly. Leibniz himself stood back for quite a while, but in the end he appealed to the Royal Society, of which he was a member, to adjudicate on this, because it had become, by 1709, 1710 or so, it had become very nasty indeed. And so he asked the Royal Society to adjudicate. The committee met, I think, once. It didn't really need to meet because Newton had already done the work for it. He had collected all the papers to show what he had done in the early years during the 1660s. He'd collected the evidence for his own priority.
Newton published his report titled Commercium Epistolicum, proving he was the inventor of calculus. Leibniz later appealed against it, but this was futile. However, not everyone agreed with Newton's philosophy, which included his theories on calculus. Around this time, it was published in the Middlesex London Postboy that the philosophy itself fully proved to be false and absurd, both by mathematical and physical demonstration. Later, though, in 1761, a newspaper article was published on the characteristics of the Newtonian philosophy. It said that the system of Sir Isaac is plainly distinguished from that of all others. This shows how society's viewpoint changed on Newton's philosophy as time went on. Unfortunately, Newton's calculus was lacking in many ways, the first of which is notation, in which Leibniz's method of calculus was much better. One reason Leibniz's notation was superior over Newton's was because it specified which variable you took the derivative of, and was easier to manipulate because it was a ratio. It is generally agreed by mathematicians today that Leibniz's notation and methods of calculus are better than Newton's. Another area Newton's method of calculus was lacking in was the explanation of concepts. His contribution was that of facilitating the operations rather than clarifying the conceptions. As Newton himself admitted in this work, his method is shortly explained rather than accurately demonstrated. So why did Britain adopt Newtonian calculus if it was hard to use and less efficient? There are two main reasons. First, it was a matter of pride for Britain, Newton's birthplace and home. Second, propaganda from the Royal Society had been spread, claiming Newton had invented calculus before Leibniz, but without any proof. Both of these reasons created a sense of responsibility to use Newtonian calculus in the British mathematicians, as Newton overshadowed Leibniz. The effects of this adoption by the British were mostly negative. It is generally agreed by historians and scholars that, looking back, the adoption of Newtonian calculus hindered Britain's progress in comparison to the continent. This was likely because the continent used Leibnizian calculus. However, there was still improvement in all aspects of mathematics. This graph shows how the accuracy of angular measurement rapidly improved as a result of the invention of calculus. Still, Britain was hindered by using Newtonian calculus for the better part of a century. This reflects how strong British national pride was during this time. They felt the responsibility to support their country in this way, even if they did have the right to choose otherwise. More specifically, they supported the Royal Society's decision about who invented calculus, even though the Royal Society did not have ultimate authority, nor was it the government. Today, mathematicians across the world primarily use Leibnizian notation. However, Newton still contributed several methods to the calculus that Leibniz had not.
3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition.
On May 5th, 1961, the first American launched into space on the Freedom 7 rocket because of calculus. The most stunning applications of calculus did not occur when it was invented. Instead, it happened hundreds of years later to do what was thought to be impossible. Calculus is perhaps one of the most important discoveries in the last 500 years. Both Newton and Leibniz are considered co-founders of calculus because they are believed to have developed their theories independently. They did correspond, and Leibniz most likely got some ideas from Newton. Even so, their published works were radically different. Newton published his works in a book called Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, while Leibniz published his works in a periodical called Acta Eruditorum.
When we look back now on the dispute between Leibniz and Newton, it's not very edifying. Tempers were lost on both sides. It became very vitriolic, very bitter as a dispute.
In conclusion, the adoption and exaltation of Newtonian calculus not only reflects the beliefs of British citizens at the time, but it also hindered mathematics in Britain for the better part of a century. In the end, the British transferred to using Leibnizian calculus instead of Newtonian calculus. As a result of too much pride, or maybe just pride over reason, Britain had declined in its growth of mathematical progress. Their responsibility to serve their country overshadowed the rights they had, but their national pride showed strongly through this choice.